Ani Buju, Jamie John Indijnakas, Makwa Nindodem, Anishinaabe King Nindojaba. And what that means for my non-Anishinaabe Moen or my English-only speakers, what I just said was, hi, hello. My name is Jamie John. My gifted name is Gnu or Golden Eagle. My clan is the Bear Clan. My ancestral territory, Anishinaabe land, means from around the Big Bay, where I come from. I'm gonna frame this talk and ask that we keep in mind as we move through this presentation something that changed the trajectory of how I go about making things when I go about making art. And it was something that I was told when I was 17 years old. It was about 6 months after the sudden death of my aunt, who was a beadworker and an artist in her own right. She was my aunt and my mom's youngest sister, and she passed away of a pulmonary embolism. And I remember attending an art lecture given by what was going to be the new director of my art department of where I was going to school. And it was given to me by a man named Clyde Sheets. And I still think about this all the time, and it guides how I enter the process of creating something. And it was that art fundamentally is a response to the world that we are expected to live in. I have been making prints since December of 2020. I had to leave school to find printmaking. Therefore I'm a primarily self-taught printmaker. I am pretty loyal to analog ways of making, working mostly in relief or block printing, with printmaking quickly becoming my main medium since then. While I focus on block printing, and I also do workshops in that medium, I also engage in letterpress, risograph, screen printing, zine making, cyanotype, and monotype making, as these are all part of the larger umbrella of printmaking and ways of making that I enjoy, but that are not necessarily relief processes strictly. I am an artist who is passionate about print, paper, education, and arts accessibility, and using work for collective liberation from capitalism and colonialism. I view printmaking as uniting my two heritages, often drawing imagery from my material culture, relationships to land and water as a native person, and prioritizing the use of Korean or Japanese plant fibers. Through process, material, and image making, I'm able to communicate and share facets of my life that would have remained unseen if not for the power printmaking has provided me. It's been almost 5 years since I made my very first print, and now printmaking has rapidly become not only my main creative practice, but has become my solace, my passion, my comfort, my safe space, my safety net, my lifeline, and quite possibly the very love of my life. There are many far more qualified people that are happy to lecture and talk more in depth about the history of printmaking and its origins and all, and its importance in specific regions of the world. What I'm gonna talk about barely scratches a surface of like 6 centuries of like art making. And I've only got like 45 minutes. It'll be like a short history overview, and then towards the end, we're gonna talk about contemporary practices in what I have come to call the age of generative generative reproduction. And I'm gonna talk to you about some contemporary artists that inspire me, who bring their values and lived experience to their practice, and transition to how I understand my own practice in relationship to printmaking history, art as our labor, embodying and enacting a DIY ethos, and my beliefs around art, accessibility, and community with the rise in generative AI imagery. Printmaking has long been a way of producing designs, texts, and images in a more accessible way than if I were a watercolor, oil painter, or sculptor. Even before the widespread use of the printing press, artists have been using print as a way to disseminate radical information, condemn war and fascist governments, and extend solidarity to marginalized people globally for centuries. From patterns on textiles to lithograph for postcards and posters, Japanese woodcuts, Inuit stone carvings, and even the more contemporary digital methods, these are all processes of transferring images from a matrix onto a surface such as paper or fabric. This is a technique that allows for multi-original works of fine art Prints can range from colorful or to monochrome, intricate or simple, outspoken or intimate. They can be easily distributed to the wider public or be produced in a select few limited editions, often depending upon the artist's access to resources, time, materials, and motivations for making. But this ability to produce multi-original works of fine art was this enormous turning point in fine arts overall, as this process meant that an image became more widely available to the public and affordable to the general public, as opposed to a painting or drawing of which only one is reproduced typically. While the need or value for traditional analog printmaking methods may not be so obvious or may seem even outdated, in a time when it's much easier to print digitally or to outsource the labor of printing to a specific shop, each and every advancement made in technique brought countless possibilities to the masses for creating captivating images in both large and small quantities, and with printmakers often utilizing multiple techniques within larger bodies of work. I'm gonna go by technique and kind of jump all over the world. I'm gonna go through some relief cut, intaglio. I'm gonna touch on silkscreen, and then at the end I'm gonna show you two really cool letterpress artists that I think are taking up the responsibility of contemporary printmakers really well. But these techniques are all very intertwined with the social and political issues at the time of their wide use, contributing to prominent historical arts and political movements for civil rights. I'm gonna try to keep the focus on printing on paper. I know printing on textiles has been practiced all over the world by many people all over the world. Printing on paper comes as a more like formal fine arts practice that wasn't up until the 15th century and the invention of paper. Apart from that, I find myself continually asserting in my practice that paper is a gorgeous, beautiful, humble, multifaceted material all on itself, and that's a hill that I'm willing to die on, so I'm gonna focus on paper here. But woodcuts emerged as fine art, and most often were a means of, at the beginning, they were a means of producing religious imagery, mostly Buddhist scriptures, or character or narrative stories involving Buddha. Soon after, artists would carve colorful depictions of everyday life, and folk tales and woodcuts could be found in people's homes. And then this is a genre of Japanese woodcuts, ukiyo-e, and it's a word that translates to pictures of the floating world. And this flourished during a time as with like subjects of historical scenes, folk tales, kabuki actors, sumo wrestlers, these more casual scenes of being in the home, flora and fauna, and travel scenes, people playing games. Even erotica started to emerge with the emergence of woodcuts. It wouldn't be until a little bit later in 1911, during the revolution that established the Republic of China, that woodcut would become an increasingly politically motivated art form, and would lead to what is called the New Woodcut movement. These are some examples. The next couple of slides are some examples of that New Woodcut movement. Early artists of that movement in the beginnings, they are, one of which is credited to Lu Xun, who came to believe that the plight of the Chinese masses could be improved through the widespread dissemination of socially aware and politically aware literature, art and literature. The woodcuts from this period are often more, you'll find that they're influenced by European artists as well, specifically German expressionists that depicted the labors of working class people. These ones are gonna address the Sino-Japanese Wars, and the global relationship to the Communist Party and its foreign allies. Another notable artist is Gu Yan, who did these two. Harvest is that first one, and I believe a party for the people and by the people is that colored poster there. And then I'm gonna jump over to Europe, where artists are using woodcuts to take a firm stance against the violence and the destruction of what we would come to know as World War I. Many artists and their peers were either conscripted, or on occasion they would voluntarily enlist, believing that the war would come to end within a couple of months. One particular artist, Kati Kalvitz, a German artist who was already widely known for her etchings and lithographs, would see the youngest of her two sons die shortly after he enlisted at 18. And this is one of the primary and one of several motivating factors for her to leading her to make the woodcut series War, which would be made up of 7 images depicting parents in grief, working conditions of the time, and loss from the violence of warfare. One of these includes, one of my favorite is Mothers, which is this one. This one is Volunteers, that talks about the working conditions of the time, and those who would voluntarily enlist. And this one depicts 2 parents in grief. Artists elsewhere in Europe, particularly the Belgian artist Frans Massariel, had been vocal about his disdain for blind nationalism, warfare, and the exploitation fundamental to capitalism, and had his woodcuts printed in many anti-war publications that were sent out beyond, not only in Belgium, but in other parts of Europe as well. He was part of a collective of consisting of the 5 other printmakers that started a publication, Lumiere. That was a major force in renewing interest in woodcuts and wood engravings, primarily in the Belgian area. This is one of the woodcuts that he would do for one of those publications. In 1917, greatly inspired by the actions of the October Revolution, a number of Slavic and Soviet artists were using woodcuts to give visuals to leftist values, societal inequities, and the positions of the proletariat. Many of these printmakers were Yugoslav and working in primarily black and white linocut for its immediacy, its clarity, and its simplicity, as well as being prized for its ability to reproduce many images. Kirsto Hygenisik and George Andreevich Kuhn are two of the ones here. Sorry, I can't get more of my slides. And some of my favorite ones are coming up. I have more slides, but they're not showing. The October Revolution, one of them famously introduced color to Russian printmaking, but who was also a part of collective of Russian printmakers at the time. Yes. Okay. Thank you, tech people. Yay. From 1910 to 1920, the Mexican Revolution would take place. This is where I start to get a little biased because I really love Mexican printmaking and Mexican-American printmaking. I think that's like really evident if you have seen my work. But this is where I had to start to like pull back on my history lesson. Thank you. But this is where I start to get biased. The Mexican Revolution would be one of the most devastating and one of the bloodiest conflicts in the country's modern history. And this would also be a defining moment for a lot of even contemporary Mexican and Mexican-American people. This is important to keep in mind because many of the printmakers that would go on to to be like very well known and prized Mexican American and Mexican printmakers were touched by this revolution in more ways than one. Whether they had to flee for safety, whether they had direct experience with conscription and warfare, whether they were bearing witness to as they were too young, and this was happening when they were coming of age, or having to fill in the gaps for the massive loss of life in the years following conflict. And so many of these artists were impacted by this revolution in more ways than one, not only in Mexico, but also you'll see influence in like Cuban printmakers, Guatemalan printmakers, Honduras printmakers, and other printmakers surrounding Central America. One of my favorites is Leopoldo Mendez. These are two woodcuts that he did about access to resources, food. They often made fun of politicians that were like literary calaveras. But Jose Guadalupe Posada is considered a founding member, a founding person in modern Mexican printmaking. I'm going to talk about him more than when we do lithographs, though. Xavier Guerrera and David Alfaro Cisqueros are two artists associated with the revolution who created woodcut images for their publication that was founded alongside Diego Rivera. In 1937, a well-known printmaking collective would be established, the Taller de Graficia Popular was established in Mexico City, and notable artists like Leopoldo Mendez that we're talking about here, Louis Arnal and Pablo Higgins, among many other artists, were using, this is some of Jose Guadalupe Posada. But they would get together, and their priority for this collective was to use their work, whether that be woodcut, whether that be lithograph, or etchings. This would be in work to advance revolutionary and social causes, making posters, flyers, banners, handbills, which is like a flyer or a pamphlet, as well as portfolio pieces that were sold in like editions and things. I think Leopoldo is very interesting because he believed very much in working collaboratively and often worked anonymously. The collective he was a founding member of saw artistic development inseparable from political development, with many members working within cultural and political institutions with this same mindset. They remained active printmakers throughout World War II, producing propaganda against Adolf Hitler and anti-capitalist reading material and works that were spread throughout Mexico. These works often focused on anti-militarism, organizing labor, and opposition to fascism. This collection gave a renewed public sense in those literary calaveras that I was just talking about, which is a Mexican tradition that surrounds Dia de los Muertos, where one writes a humorous poem criticizing, or the poem is meant to remind us of our mortality. And in this case, this collective was publishing humorous or satirical material about political leaders and other popular figures. Other prominent figures that I love, this is a Cuban printmaker. These are large-scale woodcuts. Luis Penalver Coyoza, who created these are large-scale woodcuts about Cuban conditions in opposition to U.S. imperialism. And then intaglio encompasses techniques like etching, engraving, and aquatint. This typically involves making incisions onto a copper or zinc or a similar material plate. And those incisions are where the ink is held. Famous practitioners of this technique were Albrecht Dürer, Rembrandt, and Pablo Picasso. The two that I'm going to show you are from Francisco Goya. who was a particularly socially engaged service printmaker. One of his most well-known bodies of work that was published posthumously was titled The Disasters of War. This collection covers the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon's occupation of Spain, the Peninsula War that lasted from 1808 to 1814. And unlike woodcut and lino, intaglio lent itself to more subtle and detailed images, which is why you'll see more, say, objective images of the realities of armed conflict and warfare and battlefield testimonials in etchings like this. And then almost a century after Goya, Otto Dix would, and being a contemporary of Kati Kalpitz, Otto Dix would make these etchings after he voluntarily enlisted in World War I and came back to Europe. And having enlisted with a sense of patriotism, turned to printmaking to denounce nationalism and state aggression. Unfortunately, he and Kalvitz would later be deemed degenerate artists by the rising Nazi regime, and many of Otto's works were destroyed by the Nazi propaganda and ministry. These etchings and aquatints that survive vividly depict the death, suffering, and carnage that he witnessed on the Western Front. More of Jose Guadalupe Posada, because we're talking about lithograph now. This is a Mexican artist known for creating some of the most well-known and recognizable and famous images surrounding and connecting to Dia de los Muertos, using lithograph in a very similar way to how we've seen other people use like block prints for that repeatability and things. Posada used lithograph text, humor, and satire as a means of political criticism and greatly influenced many Latin American artists during and after the Mexican Revolution. He did not live to see the end of the revolution, but his work was very much prized by those who came after him. And he continues to influence a lot of both Mexican and Mexican-American printmakers working today. Several artists who are not primarily printmakers, more of Jose Guadalupe Posada. Several artists who are not primarily printmakers, such as Pablo Picasso, Ever Manet, and others who created important bodies of anti-war lithographs, did this with the help of printmaking studio professionals and places to go to practice lithography. Now I'm gonna get into silk screens. With screen printing, or like serigraph, gained popularity in the 1960s, primarily due to like the pop works of Andy Warhol. This is actually publications from a more direct political approach. It was a publication in France, the Atelier Populaire. Brought together a group of art students and young artists who created a series of powerful political posters addressing issues around student protests on campus, the revolt against capitalism and US imperialism, and solidarity with the working class, as well as the autonomy of European universities and their role in imperialism as well. We'll see these referenced a lot. I don't consider them like anti-authoritarianism, but they are in the political canon of artworks and art making as far as like screen printing goes. The 60s were a time that called for a lot of different forms of mobilization, of activism, of protest. This was silkscreen is a material that can be done on textiles. It can be done on merchandise, product labels. It's fast. It doesn't require like too intricate of design. And as long as you have the space, you're at least able to produce, one and commit to one design. But this is in just a single year, like 1968. It marks the end of the civil rights movement that tied together not only the Black fight for civil rights, but also the Red Power movement and power for ethnic studies in universities. It was the assassination of King came after the Memphis strike of sanitation workers, the USSR and the invasion of Czechoslovakia in Prague Spring. There was the worldwide student protests of the Vietnam War, and the events of the Cold War and by proxy. But these events prompted artists to take part in using their work for mobilization, for activism, for these causes that we didn't have art as a means of escape anymore. These silkscreens also provided an easy way to distribute, spread, and disseminate information camouflaged as art. And these vivid colors, these punchy texts, these images of recognizable people would permeate throughout. Like, there's a reason we recognize them today. One of my favorite, this isn't talked about like a ton, I feel like, but some of my favorite silkscreens are the South African coloring book. It was inspired by, there was an art student, Gavin Jontis, and he was inspired to make 11 silkscreens, including the cover, to expose the realities of living under South African apartheid. As he was an art student studying in Germany, this was an assignment, but he took this time to use silkscreen and bookmaking to reproduce images and to talk about his lived experience as a person under apartheid. Because now, I think printmaking has always been used for, in this way, printmaking has always been used for critique, and now we are seeing that sort of turn inwards towards institutional art. As the 60s, now we're getting, art degrees, we're getting new art movements, we're getting formal educations in like painting and printmaking and all of these other things. But the movements of the 70s and 80s kind of needed this, like traditional art academies and institutions, while relevant, still sort of rejected printmaking. It hasn't always been welcomed with like open arms as a medium. And one of these groups that was engaging in institutional critique through printmaking was the Guerrilla Girls. By using both technological developments in like digital printmaking, we are able to have things like this be a billboard, even though it started as a silkscreen. And then this is able to be produced as a poster. One of my favorites, Dearest Art Collector. This is Ben Blount. He is a letterpress printmaker working in Evanston, Illinois. He uses words, primarily the English language, to confront anti-Blackness. These are two that he made. Another letterpress printmaker that I very much like is Demian Deneyazi, who is a Navajo printmaker. These were both done, I believe, at Maloney Printmaking in Portland, Oregon. One of them is part of an ongoing series. The other one, the Solidarity Statements one, is part of a past body of work. but I'll give you some time to read that before I talk about our new responsibilities as printmakers. But this is just like just a small overview of the multifaceted medium of printmaking and how it's been used to call for societal change. So what is our responsibility now as people who maybe have more resources, who have access, who have this knowledge? And in a time that can be really scary. There are people disappearing from the street. We have got SNAP benefits cut. This is the longest government shutdown that I've experienced in my short 25 years of being here. The rise of AI-generated imagery to the irreversible detriment of our environment, and the comfortable backsliding into comfortable conservatism from those who fund the arts. I believe that we as printmakers must recommit ourselves to being forces of revolutionary societal change, to keep in touch with the roots of our medium, and to kind of pull back a little bit. I'm going to contextualize this by introducing an essay that was written in 1935. It was written by a person named Walter Benjamin, and he wrote a very significant essay, only became very significant after his passing, but it was written in 1935, and it was called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. This is right at the time when moving pictures or movies were becoming very popular as a form of mass media and a way to reach the general public. But at the time, film didn't have like a real set sort of rules or like a logic to follow. So it was like Thomas Edison filming like a gift set of like boxing cats or whatever. And he argued that it came down to a sense of what he called aura, or this uniqueness, this here and nowness of, say, when you go to watch an actor in a play, that performance has an aura. And in this essay, he says that the camera detaches the audience from the aura of an actor's performance, as opposed to how that aura would appear if you were to go see the play live and in person, and meaning that this particular work or performance is fundamentally changed through the action of the camera and through the editing. This is contextualized within the rise of fascism in his own life, as he was writing within a world that was giving rise to the Nazi regime. And he was a German Jewish writer and cultural thinker, who often wrote about Marxist values and incorporated Jewish mysticism, even going so far as to call the work of art an instrument of magic. And this essay was written in 1935, so I'll let you do the math on that one. There's one particular quote that kind of stayed with me that I had to kind of wrap my head around a little bit. Fascism leads to an aestheticization of political life. The violation of the masses corresponds to the violence exercised by a film camera, which fascism enlists to the service of producing values. Does this mean that everybody who makes a film or like shoots a camera is a fascist? No, it doesn't. What it does mean is that the work of art in the age of reproduction is vulnerable to being stripped away or manipulated from its original set of values and context. And fascism relies on similar logics, leading to a destruction of this said aura. Because when capitalism can only offer you alienation of the worker, and capitalism becomes your target for the masses, and when that target shifts, it shifts often to outgroups, whether that be trans people, Jewish folks, Muslim people, Arab people, asylum seekers, and immigrants. Hayao Miyazaki, this is a quote famous the world over, but was shown a very early clip of what we've known as like generative AI, and he called it an insult to life itself. And he cited a story of a disabled friend that he still visits and that he experiences life with, and how his understanding of chronic illness has shaped his understanding of how to of pain. And And in other words, the problem that he had with it was aura. The reason that this comment is famous the world over is because Miyazaki was shown an image of something that was painful, but it didn't know pain. It didn't have an understanding of what it was to live in a world. It cannot respond to the world that it inhabits because it does not live in our world. Art is a response to the world we are expected to live in. Like fascist policies, fascist art is merely the appearance of art. It is state-approved aesthetics that do not need to mean anything, they just need to say. Say what? Doesn't really matter. And the reason why generative AI has been so widely embraced and praised by the alt-right is because it is a signaling of the utter contempt of labor, particularly artistic labor. If it's not the utter contempt, it's the downright hatred of artistic labor. With these images that are born without aura, without life, it effectively drives home that cruelty is the point, that art cannot be made until someone is hurting from it. It was the point when the Nazis rose to power. It is the point now with this current administration. And it's very easy to make fun of leaders, to look back and say, they are the way they are because they all wanted to be painters anyway. But it's rarely just about art or what gets to be called art. It's really easy to say that they wanted to be painters anyway, because it shifts the focus to, instead of their technical skill or instead of their ideology, it shifts the focus to technical skill or what they produced. But really, it has always been about who gets to engage with the creative process, who gets to make art, who gets to call it art, who gets to be a human person. Because that is what our creative process demands from us. It demands our dignity, it demands our autonomy, it demands our freedom, and it demands our imagination. That is what they don't like. It is not a bug, it is not a feature, it is not a bug, it is a feature that they can surpass the human need to engage in labor, specifically artistic labor. But our art is the way that we demand dignity, we demand humanity or justice, an image. I still believe a print on paper is very powerful, made by a person. And so I'm gonna go back to like what I said at the top of the lecture. Art is a response to the world that we are expected to live in. This phrase has been sort of a guide. I have like 4 minutes, oh my gosh. But I was recently told something else that I didn't really like. A few months ago, I was told by a Native woman who holds a director position at a museum, a very prominent Native museum, that I should stick to making Anishinaabe art, not political statements. I was born in the spring of '01, before 9/11. That would be the catalyst for launching the war on terror and a new wave of Islamophobia that still permeates through present-day America. I had my second birthday on the day that we invaded Iraq, and the first natural disaster I remember seeing on TV was the aftermath of the levees breaking in Hurricane Katrina. I remember being a kid on food stamps and being asked if I lived in a teepee or if my parents paid taxes to the federal government because they were Indian. I spent a majority of my elementary and all of my middle school years growing up on the res in Leelanau County, where 60% of those homes are second homes. While my elders lived in tents. I I was 14 when I saw the National Guard deployed on those at Standing Rock, and 15 when I got life-saving access to testosterone, a service that UMich has now ceased due to political intimidation, so no more minors are getting gender-affirming care like I did. I was 16 when Trump was elected for his first term as president, and a few years later, when I was able to vote for my first president, I was able to see him manufacture the consent for the starvation and attempted extermination of Palestinians and supply the occupation with the weapons and resources in order to carry it out. At present day, I am 24, with Trump in his second term, and I see the manufacturing of consent for war with Venezuela. One of the deadliest hurricanes is ripping through Jamaica, and SNAP benefits have ceased for the month of November, and it looks like it's gonna stay that way for December. And Indigenous struggles to land and water have never been more important to me. So when I'm told to stick to making Anishinaabe art and not political statements, you can only begin to understand why this phrase made me see red, especially when it came from another Native person. Because that person said that to me had a very, very grave misunderstanding of the world that I had been living in for the past 25 years. And they could not grasp or understand that the work that I made is a response to how I am expected to live in a world that has made it so clear that they would rather have me dead. Anishinaabe people have always been on the front lines of the power movement. I believe that if we go back to the simplest thing of art being a response to the world that we are expected to live in, I really do think that we can have print be our backbone, print and paper be our backbone for skill sharing, doing this through workshops. I'm rushing through like 14 pages of notes because I did not know for 45 minutes it's gonna go so fast. But collective power is something that we work towards. Empowering my workshop participants is something that I work very hard to do, affirming their right to creative expression, encouraging their voice that demands their humanness and justice and abolition in a world that would much rather have us surrender our time and attention to this, that would surrender our time and attention to despair rather than action. And paper and print hold immense power in being subversive materials for demands. And what we can do in this moment as the arts are in a state of emergency is spread power, not panic. Art is a response to the world that we live in. Spread power, not panic. Stay true to your roots as revolutionary voices in printmaking. I think that's it, because, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for all of that. Thank you all for being here. Our next talk is at 1:15, Arabic Letterpress, History and Revival with Aya Krish of Mamul Press. Jamie and Aya will both be here all day as vendors. And then 2:30 is Rizzo for the Curious with Ipsy artist Kristen Drozowski of Worthwhile Paper